My parents own a holiday home out in Quincy, California. It's a 2-acre property surrounded by forest, and we used to go there all the time as a family when my siblings and I were kids. Now that we're all adults, it's hard to coordinate schedules to meet up as a family. But back when I just started dating my girlfriend Rose, I told her about our vacation house on our 5th date, in October. The leaves were turning, making the forest in Quincy look unbelievably beautiful. Rose loved the idea of a weekend getaway. So 2 days later, we packed up and got ready for a road trip. I picked her up, and we drove for about 5 hours, talking the whole time about life, family, childhood memories, TV shows, everything. We even listened to some comedy and podcasts to pass the time. When we finally got to Quincy, we passed through the small village first. I wanted her to see how quaint it was. 10 minutes later, we were at the house. There's a small wooden gate along the driveway, which we usually keep shut when the place is empty. It's not locked, just a little deterrent to keep people from wandering onto the property. I got out to open it, and we drove in. My dad had landscapers come every 2 weeks in the summer and fall, so the place looked well kept. Rose loved it right away, and it was just about lunchtime, so we unpacked, took a quick tour, and then I turned on the hot tub to get it heating up for later. After that, we headed to town for lunch at one of my favorite spots. We did some sightseeing, visited a museum in Plumas County, and by then, the sun was going down, so we headed back. Once we got back, we relaxed in the hot tub for a while. It was chilly outside under the patio cover, but nice and warm in the hot tub itself. Then we heard the crunch of leaves nearby, like footsteps. We thought it might be some animal, so we jumped out, turned off all the lights inside and out, thinking the lights might attract a bear or some other wildlife. I peeked through one of the windows, expecting to see a bear, but instead, I saw the silhouette of a person walking along the side of the house. I ran to lock the back door, closed the curtain, and told Rose to stay quiet. We could still hear the footsteps going around the house until they got to the front door, and then they just stopped. After a moment of silence, someone knocked on the door and yelled, "Police." We were both totally confused. I went up to the door and, through it, asked, "Is there a problem?" The voice on the other side said, "We got a break-in call." I asked, "How's that possible? The nearest neighbor's a quarter-mile away." There was a noticeable pause, then the person said, "Sir, I just need you to open the door." I replied, "Sorry, I'm not comfortable doing that." Then I thought to look out a window to see if there was actually a police car out there. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out, and the dusk was still light enough to see our property, and there was no police car. I told Rose, "I don't think this guy's actually a cop." The guy outside knocked again, so I said through the door, "I don't see a police car out there, so I'm not comfortable opening the door." He didn't reply. After another tense silence, we thought he'd left, but a few minutes later, we heard heavy footsteps walking away from the door, like he'd been standing there the whole time, watching us. I took a quick look through the window again but couldn't see anyone. He must have walked off in a different direction. The scary part was knowing we were surrounded by forest. He could come from literally any angle. We definitely weren't going back outside that night. I did quickly turn off the bubbles in the hot tub, though, and then we just stayed in the bedroom, watched some movies, and eventually went to sleep. I kept my dad's shotgun from the closet under the bed just in case. The next day, we went hiking in the Plumas National Forest, grabbed some food, and even watched a movie at the local theater. When we got back to the house, it was dark. As we pulled up, Rose suddenly gasped, and I nearly slammed on the brakes, thinking I was about to hit something. But she was pointing at someone walking quickly away from the house, disappearing into the woods. I tried to keep Rose calm as she started panicking, saying someone was stalking us. I told her, "It's okay, we have a gun, and we're leaving in the morning anyway." I was scared too, but I pulled the car as close to the house as I could, and we rushed inside. I double-checked every door and window, made sure everything was locked, and we didn't step outside again that night. We packed everything up so we'd be ready to leave in the morning. We spent the rest of the night in the bedroom watching a movie before finally going to bed. Sometime in the night, I started hearing a weird noise outside. It'd go on for a few seconds, stop, then start up again. I couldn't figure out what it was, but something was definitely going on. I was afraid that guy had come back, so I waited until the noise stopped completely before quietly getting out of bed. I didn't want to wake Rose. I went to the window, opened the curtain a little, and came face to face with that same man, looking in. He definitely saw me. I stumbled back, yelling, and Rose woke up. I didn't say a word, I just grabbed the shotgun from under the bed, made sure it was loaded, and went out the back door. I fired a few shots in the air, yelling like a maniac, hoping to scare off anyone out there. After 3 shots, I went back inside, told Rose what happened, and weirdly, I felt a bit of relief, like I'd taken control of the situation. When the adrenaline wore off, though, we were just lying there, too scared to hear any noise from outside. We somehow made it through the night, and the next morning, I called the cops just to report everything. I've gone back there with my family a few times since, and luckily, that guy has never shown up again. I was driving through Colorado around midnight, somewhere near Tabernash. It was probably close to 1 a.m. when I stopped for gas and a quick snack at a station. After that, I got back on the road. The highway was totally empty, no cars at all, especially on the roads I was taking. But even though it was late, I was sticking close to the speed limit. I was tired, and you never know when a cop might be hiding out. Then suddenly, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror, red and white ones. I looked back and saw a car with flashing lights behind me. So I pulled over, but before I did, I glanced at my speed. I was only 2 miles over the limit, if that. I stopped on the side of the road, and so did the car behind me. I was really annoyed because I'd never been pulled over this late at night, and I'm usually super careful. I instantly felt something was off about this stop. When the officer walked up to my car, I rolled down my window and he asked for my license and registration. I tried to keep my cool, like I knew my rights and wasn't going to let him push me around. I asked, "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" He said he'd get to that in a minute. I told him I knew I wasn't speeding, hadn't swerved, and all my lights were working fine. So I wasn't planning to hand over my license if this was an illegal stop. I glanced at his uniform. It looked odd, not fully black. He had a jacket that looked like a police jacket, but it didn't say police anywhere on it. There was no police badge either, and he just said he was with some kind of task force. He kept insisting on my license and registration, so I flat out asked him, "Are you even a real cop?" He said he was with a special unit and then asked for my license again. I asked, "What's your badge number?" He said he didn't have to give that out. I knew enough about traffic stops to know that was a lie. I also noticed his lights were only red and white, no blue. I wasn't 100% sure that meant he was a fake cop, but it definitely felt sketchy. Then he told me to step out of the car, so I told him, respectfully, that I didn't feel comfortable doing that unless he got a supervisor out here. He raised his voice, got more aggressive, telling me again to get out of the car. I told him, "I don't think you're a real cop. If you were, you wouldn't mind getting a supervisor here." Then I started rolling up my window, and he did not like that. He started yelling at me to open the door, putting his hands on my window and trying to open it. I shoved his hands off, started up the car, and put it in drive. I could hear him yelling, "Stop," as I pulled away, my heart racing. I was just hoping I was right, or else I'd end up in jail. But at the same time, I really hoped he was a fake, because the whole situation was terrifying. As I sped off, I saw his car in my rearview mirror, lights on, coming up fast behind me. So I did the only thing I could think of, I called 911. I told the dispatcher that someone was chasing me, claiming to be a cop, but he refused to give his badge number, his car wasn't marked, he didn't have blue lights, and his uniform didn't even look right. After asking my location more details, she said it sounded suspicious and gave me directions to the nearest police station, the Fraser Winter Park station, and told me an officer would meet me there. The guy was still following me halfway to the station, lights on and everything. But suddenly, as we got close to a big intersection, he turned off his lights and took a right, driving out of sight. That's when I knew my gut had been right all along, he really wasn't a cop. I drove to the police station, where an officer was already waiting in his patrol car in the lot. He got out right away, like he knew I was coming, and I told him all the details. He made notes, got my contact info in case they needed me for anything, and then he took off toward the intersection where the guy had turned. A few minutes later, I was back on the road, feeling super relieved that I trusted my instincts and didn't get out of the car. I can only imagine where things would have ended up if I had. I'm 29 years old and live alone in my house in a small Michigan town. I come out here on weekends to escape the city life I've spent most of my life in. I love the peaceful, rural setting. My house and land feel like they're right out of a horror movie. It's a big property, with the nearest neighbors not exactly right next door, and we don't hear much about crime here, mostly because the population is pretty low. I don't have a lot of friends in the area, but that's not really why I come out here. I come to be alone and get away from work stress and people in general. On a Friday evening, not long after I arrived at the house, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man with a clipboard. Right away, I figured he was selling something. He asked if I was happy with my security system, and I told him I didn't have one, but wasn't interested either. I even joked that no one would want to break into an ugly old house like this. But he didn't give up. He launched into a pitch, talking about recent break-ins in the area that I hadn't heard about. Then he asked who I lived with. I told him I lived alone, so I didn't really need one. Still, he was persistent and asked if he could at least get my phone number to check back in a couple of weeks. Thinking it sounded harmless, I gave him my number, he thanked me, and left. I headed to the kitchen to start making dinner, then settled in to binge-watch Yellowstone in the living room. Hours passed, and I was still glued to the couch, episode after episode. Around 11 p.m., there was another knock on the door. This was way past any reasonable time to be knocking, especially around here. With no close neighbors, I couldn't imagine who it would be. I ignored it and kept watching my show, but the knocking continued. I hadn't turned on any lights, so I wasn't sure if they even knew I was home. But when the knocking came a third time, I started to worry that they weren't going to leave. I went to the door and called out, asking who was there. There was no answer. It felt straight out of a horror movie. I had no desire to open the door to see who it was. So I just yelled through the door that I wasn't interested in anything they were selling and added that I had a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. In reality, I didn't actually have a gun, but I figured the threat might make them back off. The knocking finally stopped, so I thought it had worked. I went back to the couch, but then my phone rang. The caller ID read 911 Emergency Services. I'd never gotten a call from 911 in my life and didn't even know it was something they did. I picked up the phone, and a man on the other end asked if this was George. I told him yes. He said, "This is the police department. We have officers outside your house right now. There's been a report of a crime on your property, and we need to ask you some questions." I asked this so-called dispatcher to have the officers step to the window so I could identify them before opening the door. He said they couldn't do that because they were already positioned outside, which made no sense to me. I told him I wasn't going to answer any questions and hung up. Even if they were real police, I had no legal obligation to open my door. This all felt like an obvious setup. They tried calling again from the same number, which I ignored, then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. I actually decided to call 911 myself to ask if these calls were legit. Right away, the Real dispatcher told me that they definitely were not. They also advised me to lock everything, grab anything I could use as a weapon, and wait inside until an actual police officer could get to my house. As I was talking to them on the phone, I heard someone jiggling the handle of the back door, trying to push it open. Then they started kicking it hard, trying to break in. The bangs on the door were loud, I told the dispatcher, and they assured me police would be there in under 10 minutes. I needed them now, though. I shouted, "Do you want to get shot?" and heard a yell from the other side. Unlike the front door, my back door was next to a window, so I peeked through and saw two masked men trying to break it down. Their faces were covered with those creepy, bag-like masks with cutouts for eyes and mouths. They saw me watching them and must have realized I was on the phone with the real police, because they ran off into the dark. About 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and this time it was the actual police. I let them in, and one of the officers was especially helpful. He even checked the whole property with his flashlight, making sure no one was hiding. They kept a squad car parked outside my house for the next few hours with its lights on to make sure no one came back. I'm pretty sure that guy who claimed to be selling security systems was just scouting for an easy target. He and his buddies must have been impersonating emergency calls to trick people into opening their doors late at night. The next day, I went to my nearest neighbor and asked if the guy had knocked on their doors too. They said no, which made it even clearer that I'd been their target.